Hey guys, tonight we step into a cold darker than silence. A door slams behind you, thick wood ceiling shut with a groan that echoes down a corridor. Outside, the wind is howling like it's trying to speak. Inside, only the creak of old beams and the sharp scent of frozen pine sap. Footsteps crunch over ice. A shape moves through the snow. No coat, no gloves, just a long wet robe clinging to his legs. His hair is tangled, black as ravens, and his eyes, they shine with something unsettling. He's not supposed to be alive, but he is. For now. If this atmospheric history helps you slow down and drift off, a like and a sub would mean a lot. Tell me where you're listening from tonight and what time it is. I love hearing from you. Now take a breath, get warm, and follow me into the storm. The man in the snow isn't a soldier, though Russia is choking on war. He's not a priest, though he speaks of God with fire in his voice. He's something else, something the villagers won't name aloud. Out here deep in the frozen spine of Siberia, the church bells are afraid to ring his name, and yet he walks toward them. Grigory Yefimovich Rasputin, born a nobody, son of a farmer and part-time messenger rider, isn't expected to become anything more than a set of calloused hands. His village, Pokrovsko, is so remote you could scream for a week and only the wolves would answer. His mother calls him strange. His father calls him lazy. The neighbors call him touched. By what? No one agrees on. They say when he was 8, he touched a horse's chest and calmed it mid-frenzy. They say when he was 10, he stared at the sky for 3 days straight without blinking. That may be an exaggeration. Historians still argue whether young Rasputin's trances were divine or just daydreams. But what is certain is that his strangeness grew like a vine through his bones. He's not educated. He never learns to read properly. But something burns in him anyway, something urgent and vast. He begins talking about visions, saints, flames in the sky, a voice that tells him to walk. So at 28, he does. Leaves behind his wife, his children, his father's scowl. No money, no plan, just his feet and the road and the strange pull of God, or whatever it is that calls him. In Russian tradition, these wandering holy men are called straniki. They walk the earth barefoot, begging bread, praying in whispers, appearing and vanishing like dreams. Rasputin is now one of them, and he walks far, to monasteries, shrines, mountain chapels, sometimes in snow up to his knees, his skin blue from cold, eyes wide with fever. He starves, he chants, he sleeps in haylofts and on cold floors, talks to strangers, tells them things he shouldn't know. The funny thing is, people listen. That's the part the church didn't expect. The sermons are strange, full of fire and quiet laughter. He doesn't speak like a scholar. He speaks like someone who's been singed by lightning and thinks you should be too. Some believe him, others fear him. Once, in a monastery near Verkhoturia, Rasputin falls into a fit while praying. He collapses, twitching, muttering in tongues. A monk, older, silent, watches. When Rasputin wakes, the man hands him water and says only, "God will either save you or destroy you. You decide which it will be." We don't know if that monk was real. Rasputin claims he was. He remembers his name, but no one else does. After that, something shifts. Rasputin becomes bolder. Stranger. Some say he meets a secretive sect, the Klists, flagellants who dance themselves into trance, scream prayers in ecstasy, and believe that sin is a path to salvation. Rasputin never admits it, but later his teachings begin to sound suspiciously Klist-like. He talks of divine forgiveness before sin, of flesh being the door to spirit. You can see how the church might start sweating. Still, he returns to his village, settles down, at least on the outside. But now the villagers look at him differently. He speaks with a weight he didn't have before. He lays hands on the sick. Some say they recover. Others say they scream and flee. One time, he predicts a barn fire before it starts. He wakes up shouting, "The hay will burn." And 2 hours later, it does. That one really gets around. By now, Rasputin's appearance is noticeable. He's tall, lanky. He has these piercing pale blue eyes that seem to shine under candlelight. His beard grows wild. His clothes are stained, patched, often stinking. He doesn't wash often. He says cleanliness is vanity. Also, he says demons don't like dirt. That's either practical or deranged, depending on your angle. One thing's certain, people start visiting. Peasants, pilgrims, even a few curious aristocrats from the region. They want blessings, healings, advice. They want him to look at them and say something true. And he usually does. It's not long before the church in Tobolsk hears about it. A priest visits, asks Rasputin who gave him the right to preach. Rasputin smiles, says, "God doesn't need permission." That doesn't go over well. But the priest can't prove heresy, yet, so he leaves fuming. Meanwhile, Rasputin writes letters. Badly. Messy grammar, scrambled syntax, all sharp slashes of ink. But they get noticed. Eventually, one ends up in the hands of a bishop named Hermogen. And Hermogen, well, he's curious. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Rasputin first travels to St. Petersburg in 1903 under invitation from religious officials who think he might be the real deal, or at least an amusing novelty. Here's your fringe tidbit. Some early believers claim Rasputin had a second belly button. No one ever confirms this, but rumors like that tend to stick. The first time he steps into the capital, Rasputin's scent reportedly makes a noblewoman faint. Whether from belief or body odor remains unclear. But more importantly, he captures attention in salons, in churches, even in the shadowy corridors of the Tsar's advisors. He's not yet powerful, but he's no longer just a monk in a snowstorm. And somewhere deep in the candlelit halls of a cathedral, a priest leans forward and whispers to another. There's something wrong with him. He doesn't blink. The flicker of gaslight does strange things to shadows, especially in a city like St. Petersburg, where elegance masks rot and everyone's whispering through a smile. Here, Rasputin doesn't just look out of place. He looks like a walking contradiction. He's a peasant in a palace town. He doesn't bow. He doesn't flatter. He stares too long. And still people lean in when he speaks. This is where things begin to blur. Where spiritual awe mixes with scandalous intrigue. Because now, the question hanging in the air isn't what Rasputin is. It's why people believe him. You're told he's a man of God, but when you meet him, you get the creeping sense he's not reading scripture so much as writing his own. He speaks like a prophet, but smells like someone who wrestled a goat in a sauna. He touches your shoulder and your fever breaks. He touches your soul and you're not sure it's yours anymore. He says things like, to be pure, you must sin. He says pain is holy. That ecstasy is closer to heaven than prayer. The elite don't know whether to report him or invite him to dinner. And still, people follow. The church doesn't know what to do. At first, they laugh him off. Some smelly mystic from Siberia? Please. But then he's invited to speak at gatherings of clergy, then bishops, then nobles. One of them is the Grand Duchess Militsa, wife of Grand Duke Peter Nikolaevich. She finds him magnetic. She introduces him to her sister, Anastasia. They call Rasputin a starets, a holy man, a wanderer of divine fire. It's through them that Rasputin is brought to the court. Now, let's pause here. This moment matters, because history has a pattern. Someone rises from the mud, says something people aren't ready to hear, and they either end up in a palace or a pit. Sometimes both. Historians still argue whether Rasputin truly believed he was doing God's work or whether he simply loved the attention. But either way, the man walked into the Tsar's palace like he'd always belonged. Nicholas II meets Rasputin in 1905. The Tsar notes in his diary, "We made the acquaintance of a man of God, Grigory from Tobolsk province. It's brief, polite, but something clicks." The Tsarina, Alexandra, is more than intrigued. She's relieved. Because her son Alexei is dying, not visibly, not every day, but quietly, dangerously. He bleeds without cause. A bump, a bruise, a stumble, and blood pours. His body doesn't clot. The doctors whisper the word hemophilia, though it's almost taboo. It means fragility, doom. It means the Romanov line might end with a child who can't stop bleeding. So when Rasputin comes, Alexandra watches him like he's the last candle in a storm. And Rasputin, in the presence of the boy, does what doctors couldn't. He calms him, he prays, and the bleeding stops. That's the story. We don't know how. There are theories. He may have advised stopping aspirin, which worsens bleeding. He may have hypnotized the child into calming down, lowering blood pressure. Or maybe it was luck. But to the Tsarina, it's not luck. It's salvation. From this moment forward, Rasputin is not just a mystic. He is the lifeline of the throne. Now you've got a peasant monk sitting at the feet of the most powerful woman in Russia, whispering prayers and secrets. Not in public, never in court, but in the shadows, behind closed doors. And it's starting to look suspicious. He's not discreet. He boasts. He drinks. He gets caught up in the ecstasy of his own legend. Women seek him out, not just for blessings. He lays hands freely. He's seen drunk, staggering from salons. One story has him biting into a roast chicken with his bare hands while reciting the Lord's Prayer. Still, the church keeps its distance, for now, because he's close to the Tsar, and the Tsar is God's chosen, right? But the whispers are building. Some say Rasputin heals not with prayer, but with spells, that he stares into a person and sees their sins, and sometimes uses them. One noble woman claims he knew she stole a ring once. Another says he told her about a miscarriage she never confessed. It could be gossip, could be theatrics, or it could be that Rasputin was simply a master at reading weakness. One day he's seen at the Kazan Cathedral. He walks in barefoot, kisses the floor, mutters in tongues. A priest asks him to leave. Rasputin replies, "God doesn't live here anymore." Yeah, that didn't go over well. Later in confession, the same priest says he felt an invisible heat where Rasputin had stood, as though the devil had been there. Again, it might be embellishment, but the fear was real. Here's your mainstream historical fact. After 1905, Rasputin becomes a recurring presence in the imperial inner circle, especially with Tsarina Alexandra, who believed God had sent him to protect her son. Here's your quirky tidbit. Rasputin often claimed that eating too much sugar angered the angels. He preferred honey. "Bees are holy," he said. "They sting liars." You can't make that up. But now the priests are growing uneasy. They don't like his eyes. They don't like his freedom. And they definitely don't like his theology. It dances too close to heresy. He doesn't speak of sin as punishment. He speaks of sin as gateway. That to truly repent, you must first truly fall. That flesh is a battlefield, but also a road. It's dangerously close to Gnostic thinking. Even worse, it's seductive. Rasputin has no church of his own, but somehow he gathers followers, not in pews, but in private rooms. He tells them things the Orthodox Church never would. He tells them God is not found in silence, but in suffering. That the more you fall, the higher you rise. It's powerful and deeply unnerving. One night, a group of priests convenes behind closed doors. One writes later, "We must act. This is not a man of God, but something else, something darker." The label is whispered first in jest, then with fear. Demon. The word clings to Rasputin like incense, heavy, sweet, dangerous, and everywhere he walks, it follows.
Yep.
Midwinter. A frost creeps up the palace windows like a living thing. Candles drip onto silver. And there he is, Grigory Rasputin, shuffling into a noble's dining room, mud on his boots, eyes wild as always, beard trailing crumbs from the last loaf of black bread he inhaled, like it owed him money. And yet, no one stops him. They make space, they hand him wine, they listen when he speaks. Imagine that. You're a count, dressed in your best velvet, and this lanky mystic with hay in his beard tells you your wife has a secret. Your leg will ache before the spring thaw, and you should stop lying about where you were last Tuesday. And he's right. Over and over, Rasputin says things no one should know. Private things. Shameful things. People go pale. One duchess faints. A general refuses to speak around him, muttering, "That man walks with ears that don't belong to him." How does he do it? Maybe he listens. Maybe he has spies. Maybe he watches people so closely, it's like reading their diaries through their skin. Or maybe, just maybe, he really is tapped into something larger. Whatever it is, people can't stay away. By 1906, he's no longer a curiosity. He's an infection. He's on everyone's lips. They say he can heal, yes, but also curse. That he's protected. That if you cross him, things go wrong in your house. Your horses get sick. Your wife stops sleeping. Mirrors fall off the wall for no reason. Now, some of that's probably coincidence. But as the saying goes, fear doesn't need facts, just stories. And Rasputin. He provides plenty. Let's talk about those so-called blessings. His approach is unorthodox. He likes physical touch, a lot of it. He'll stare into your eyes, breathe heavily, place both hands on your shoulders, and whisper prayers so close to your ear you can feel his beard tickle your jaw. Some say they feel warmth, some say they black out. Others, well, they say nothing, but they come back again. He blesses women in dark rooms, often alone. When asked, he says the Holy Spirit prefers privacy. At least once, a lady-in-waiting is found sobbing after one of these blessings. No one investigates, and still, the Empress defends him. The Tsar listens. The boy, Alexei, continues to survive. That last one matters more than all the others. Because each time Alexei falls and the doctors fail, Rasputin shows up. He touches the child's forehead. He prays. Sometimes he just whispers over the phone, "Yes, really," and the bleeding stops. Historians still argue whether it was faith healing, hypnosis, dumb luck, or just Rasputin intuitively knowing what not to do. But the results speak louder than the guesses. The Empress now refers to him as our friend. She says he was sent by God, that he is the lamp guiding their household. Others say he's the moth drawing the flame. Now, here's your mainstream historical fact. Rasputin's influence over the royal family becomes increasingly controversial after 1907, particularly as his political advice starts leaking into royal decisions. And your fringe tidbit. Rasputin refused to eat anything blue. He claimed the color reminded him of death and tasted like sky rot. He also said, God never made blue food on purpose. It gets weirder. A well-known priest, Father Iliador, initially a supporter, turns violently against Rasputin. He begins calling him a devil in disguise, claims he saw Rasputin levitate during a private prayer. No one can prove it, but Iliador later throws ink at a bishop and flees into exile. His testimony, equal parts raving and riveting. And yet Rasputin just keeps rising. At social events, nobles eye him with a mix of contempt and terror. One count tries to mock him, calling him holy stinker. Rasputin laughs, hard. The next month, that count is suddenly stripped of a government post. Coincidence? Maybe. But the timing is eerie. Rasputin has no title, no office, no church rank. But people now say, behind closed hands, that he controls the empire through Alexandra, that the empress listens to him more than the Tsar, that if he whispers a name, it rises or falls. And all the while, Rasputin keeps doing what Rasputin does: drinking, blessing, wandering the halls half drunk, barefoot, muttering about the coming fire. That part catches people's ears. He starts saying strange things, prophecies. The bear will bleed. The ice will crack where you least expect. A crown will fall, and beneath it will be a child crying blood. People write these things down. They don't know what they mean, but they remember. Even stranger, some of them come true. Here's one that stuck. A servant reports hearing Rasputin whisper through a keyhole, "If I die by the hands of nobles, the Tsar's family won't last 2 years." That quote will haunt history. But we're not there yet. Not quite. Right now, we're still watching this peasant, this wandering prophet with chicken grease on his sleeves, stand in a room full of satin and gold and make everyone go quiet with just a look. A high-ranking bishop finally writes to the Patriarch of Moscow. The man's influence is unnatural. I suspect sorcery. The church has begun to shift. First it laughed, then it tolerated. Now it fears. But here's the problem. Rasputin doesn't play by their rules. He doesn't fear them. He doesn't respect the power of robes and titles. And worse, he doesn't need them. He's built something else. A throne of whispers, healed wounds, secrets, and dread. And from there, he watches the men who hate him fumble through sermons about humility and grace while quietly plotting his downfall. Not that it bothers him. Rasputin once told a visitor, "Let the wolves howl. The moon still rises." And in St. Petersburg, the wolves are howling. The church has been patient, too patient. They watched as Rasputin shuffled into their sanctuaries like he owned the icons, kissed the floor like he was daring it to open up and swallow him. They listened as he twisted scripture into knots, turning sin into salvation, and called it holy work. But now they've had enough. They're not just whispering in sacristies anymore. They're meeting, quietly, strategizing, because there's a word spreading, slithering under cassocks and candlelight, one that's more dangerous than heretic. Kleist. In public, the Kleisti are nothing. They don't exist. An outlawed sect, ancient, dangerous, practically myth. But in private, they're feared, worship through pain, forgiveness through ecstasy. They dance, chant, whip themselves into holy frenzy. They believe sin must be tasted to be transcended. And the rumors say Rasputin was one of them. He never admits it. In fact, when questioned, he laughs and says, "The only sect I know is hunger." But too many of his teachings echo theirs. Too many followers of his speak of spiritual fever, of confession as performance, of redemption through flesh. It's enough to make the Holy Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church sweat into their beards. In 1909, a woman named Maria, once a devoted follower, goes public with a story. She claims Rasputin forced her to confess her darkest secrets while he prayed over her body, touching her with holy urgency. She describes ceremonies behind locked doors, with candles, chants, and trembling limbs. She says he told her the only way to purify the soul was to tempt the body. Now, maybe she's telling the truth. Maybe she's furious at being cast aside. Or maybe it's both. Historians still debate whether Maria's testimony was revenge or revelation. But either way, it fuels the fire. The church now has ammunition, accusations of spiritual abuse, heresy, association with outlawed sects, blasphemy wrapped in greasy robes. And yet, they still can't touch him. Because Rasputin isn't just some rural preacher anymore. He's the confidant of the Tsarina, the healer of the air, the walking, sweating, wine-soaked symbol of divine intervention. If they move against him, they move against her. And nobody wants to poke the bear when the bear sleeps beside the throne. Still they try. Bishop Hermigan, once cautiously interested in Rasputin, now turns against him completely. He calls him a devil cloaked in the skin of a man. He says Rasputin's eyes do not blink because they do not see with the soul. Poetic, if a little dramatic. Hermigan teams up with Father Iliador, the same fiery priest who later pelts a bishop with ink and gets exiled to Norway. Together, they confront Rasputin at a dinner party. The details are foggy, but this much is known. Rasputin is accused of heresy to his face. He doesn't deny it. He doesn't argue. He stands up, drains a glass of wine, and says only, "God sees further than men." Then he leaves. Later that night, Hermigan is dragged from his chambers by secret police and placed under house arrest. Guess who made the call? The Empress herself. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In 1911, Prime Minister Stolypin tried to exile Rasputin from court. The Tsarina's resistance was so fierce that Nicholas II himself had to walk a diplomatic tightrope to avoid full political fallout. And your fringe tidbit. Rasputin believed that sleep was a form of divine travel. He claimed his spirit could float out of his body and visit the dreams of people he cared for or feared. So now imagine being a bishop who just called him a devil and then trying to fall asleep. It gets even stranger. Rasputin starts appearing in public more, not preaching, just existing, shopping, eating, drinking, laughing loudly with women on park benches. For someone considered a religious advisor, he sure doesn't hide his vices. But this too is deliberate. Because for Rasputin, the line between sacred and profane isn't just blurry, it doesn't exist. He tells people that God made all things, even temptation. That guilt is a prison the church invented to keep people scared. That true purity comes not from avoiding sin, but from devouring it and surviving. And the people, some gasp, some swoon, some spit. But they remember. This man, this ragged prophet with wine-stained teeth and a laugh like gravel in a tin cup, is rewriting religion in the alleys of St. Petersburg. And he's doing it without a pulpit. Still, the church keeps hunting for a crack, something legal, something provable. They start digging into his finances, looking for bribes, hidden payments, a scandal they can pin to the wall and say, "Aha, heretic and thief." But Rasputin lives mostly on gifts and handouts. He doesn't own land, doesn't hoard gold. He just drifts, like a ghost in dirty boots. Frustratingly incorruptible in all the wrong ways. They even send spies to his gatherings. But these aren't open churches. They're salons, dinners, whispered meetings in candlelit rooms where theology is served with stew and seduction. What's said there never leaves whole, only in fragments. Let your sin be strong. God watches most closely when we fall. The church fears what it cannot tame. One bishop hears this and writes, "He is not a preacher. He is is a spell, and he is working. Still, Rasputin isn't stupid. He knows pressure is building. He spends more time away from the capital, visiting old friends, small churches, monasteries that still welcome him. Sometimes he stays up for 3 nights straight, pacing, muttering. "It's coming," he says. "The serpent is rising." People think he means war. Others think he's just losing his grip. But he always comes back, always smiling, always with some new strange story, a dream, a vision, a woman healed, a general shamed, a prophecy. He once tells a noblewoman, "I saw a river of fire under the palace. Soon it will reach the baby's cradle." What does it mean? No one knows, but they remember. And the church? They keep watching, waiting. Their sermons sharpen, their prayers grow louder, and their fear grows deeper. Because the more they call him a demon, the more people believe he's something more than just a man. And demons, after all, don't die easy. Somewhere in the palace, beyond the velvet drapes and marble busts, a little boy coughs. Not the kind of cough you worry about, the kind that lingers, that whispers of bruises beneath the skin, of blood where there shouldn't be blood. Alexei Romanov, heir to the Russian throne, lives on borrowed breath, and Rasputin, this half-wild peasant mystic, is now the unofficial guardian of that breath. That alone would be enough to make the church twitch. But Rasputin? He doesn't stop there. He starts sitting in on political discussions. Not officially, of course. He has no title. He doesn't even own a decent pair of shoes. But he's there, standing behind curtains, whispering into the Empress's ear like the ghost of fate. Ministers come and go. Policies shift. And behind every strange change is the same familiar shadow. A lanky figure in a torn coat who insists that God doesn't care about tax reform, but definitely wants General so-and-so fired. And Alexandra listens, because when her boy bleeds, no one else stops it. The doctors panic, the nurses pray, but only Rasputin can walk into that quiet room, place his hands on the child's forehead, and make the bleeding slow. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In 1912, while on a family visit to Spala, Poland, Alexei suffered a life-threatening hemorrhage. Alexandra telegraphed Rasputin, who replied with a calm message, "The little one will not die. Do not allow the doctors to bother him too much." Miraculously, the boy recovered the next day. Here's your fringe tidbit. Rasputin claimed he never actually slept the night before healing Alexei. He said angels stood at his bed and sang warnings into his mouth. When asked what that meant, he shrugged and said, "They always sing flat." Now the palace servants are whispering. They say Rasputin's footsteps don't echo, that he never knocks, doors just open, that once a candle blew out near him and relit on its own, that the dog, a massive black hound meant to guard the royal family, cowers when Rasputin enters. Superstition? Maybe. But in a place where crowns depend on children surviving fevers, even superstition gets a seat at the table. And outside that table, the nobility is furious. Rasputin is everywhere and nowhere. He visits aristocrats, listens to their confessions, then whispers their secrets to rivals. He's like a sieve. Everything leaks, and he doesn't apologize. He drinks openly now, slurs scripture into a glass of plum brandy, smacks young noblemen on the back, and says things like, "God doesn't mind if you sin, just don't bore him." He sings loudly at dinner parties, sometimes improvising songs that rhyme empress with mistress. People laugh, people cringe, people wonder if he's testing them. And still, they come to him. Women especially. They flock to his side, wide-eyed and nervous. He calls them my doves. He lays hands on their shoulders, their backs, their temples. He speaks of healing and light and God's fire in the belly. Some say it's innocent. Some say it's manipulation. Others won't say anything at all, but they keep coming back. The church sends warnings, letters, quiet scoldings delivered with perfumed hands and forced smiles. But Alexandra shields him like a relic. She trusts no one else, not even the Tsar's own advisors. Historians still argue whether Rasputin consciously cultivated this influence or whether Alexandra, desperate for control in a collapsing empire, gave it to him piece by piece. Either way, the outcome's the same. The Holy Synod meets in emergency session. They've never encountered anything like this. A spiritual crisis wrapped in a political disaster, topped with beard oil and irreverence. They label him a corrupter of the faith. They urge the Tsar to dismiss him from court. But Nicholas hesitates. Because Alexandra isn't hesitating. She says Rasputin was sent by God, that to deny him is to invite divine punishment, that without him, Alexei will die. So the Synod tries another route. They start tracking Rasputin. Spies, informants, tense little men in hats scribbling down who he sees, what he drinks, where he spends the night. The reports are scandalous. He's seen entering brothels, leaving them with lipstick smudged across his collar, attending parties where the vodka flows like scripture, and the dancing lasts until sunrise. They collect the reports, bind them together, and send them to Nicholas. He reads them. Then he tosses them in the fire. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Rasputin works. The child still lives. The bleeding still stops. And as long as that keeps happening, the Empress will protect him, like a lioness protects her cub. Even if that means burning the church to the ground. Here's something that slipped into rumor. One night, a bishop confronted Rasputin and demanded he renounce his sins. Rasputin allegedly leaned close and whispered, "I have no sins, only mirrors." Let that sit with you. But even mirrors can crack. In 1913, the Romanov dynasty celebrated its 300th anniversary. Parades, orchestras, fireworks. But beneath the pomp, there's rot, bread riots, workers striking, and Rasputin, of course, drinking champagne in a borrowed fur coat, predicting doom. He tells someone, "The snow will run red before the Tsar sees the spring." Poetic, also deeply unsettling. That spring, his enemies strike. A noble woman invites him to tea. He arrives expecting conversation. Instead, she slashes his stomach with a knife and screams, "I have killed the Antichrist." She hasn't. Rasputin survives. Barely. He's sewn back together by terrified doctors who claim he shouldn't have lived. He spends weeks recovering, then reportedly sits up in bed and mutters, "They will try again, but it's not time yet." He sends the noblewoman a letter. He forgives her. The church calls it saintly, or manipulative, or insane. No one agrees, but the message is clear. Rasputin isn't going anywhere. And now he's seen death's face and come back laughing. So the church does what it does best when afraid. It sharpens its knives and prepares the rites. Not for exorcism, for excommunication. Seeing, imagine the silence inside a cathedral after all the candles go out. That heavy hush, like even the air has stopped believing. That's the kind of silence Rasputin brings into a room now. Not because he demands it, not even because he asks for it, but because the people watching him, the priests, the servants, the nobles with trembling spoons, can feel something coming, something wrong, something cold. And in the middle of it stands Rasputin, muttering to himself about fire and snow, licking honey off his fingers, smiling like the world is a joke only he understands. But the church has stopped laughing. They've tried polite, they've tried silent, they've tried sending priests, letters, even investigators. Nothing worked, so now they do the unthinkable. They go public. At a high mass, a respected bishop stands up and declares, This man is not of God. He is a blight, a shadow, a walking mockery of holiness. He doesn't say Rasputin's name. He doesn't have to. Everyone already knows. Soon after, another archbishop delivers a sermon titled "The Demon Among Us." His voice echoes through a marble cathedral, and when he says evil, the choir goes quiet. When he says false prophet, an old woman crosses herself so fast she drops her prayer book. It's official now. The gloves are off. The bearded mystic who wandered barefoot from Siberia is being called a demon by the highest voices in the Russian Orthodox Church. And the city notices. Some cheer. Finally, they say. Finally, the church is calling out this filthy sorcerer who drinks like a Cossack and gropes like a Roman senator. Others hesitate, because yes, Rasputin is strange, but he heals. He knows things. And didn't Jesus walk among lepers too? Historians still argue whether these public condemnations helped or hurt the church's cause. On one hand, they drew attention to Rasputin's sins. On the other, they elevated him to martyr status in the eyes of the desperate and devout. And Rasputin, he doesn't respond directly. Instead, he visits a monastery just outside the city, walks barefoot in the snow, kneels at a frozen spring. When a monk asks him if he's angry at the church, Rasputin says only, "Can the fire be angry at the wood it consumes?" That quote spreads like frostbite. Now, here's your mainstream historical fact. In 1914, the Holy Synod officially pressured Tsar Nicholas II to remove Rasputin from court influence. Nicholas refused, citing Alexandra's trust in him and his help with the Tsarevich's health. And here's your fringe tidbit. Rasputin reportedly told a court seamstress that he didn't fear the church because their god sleeps in golden shoes. When she asked what that meant, he replied, "My God walks with no feet and listens with no ears, and he likes the smell of rain." You can't put that on a pulpit. More bishops speak out. Sermons grow sharper. Church papers run editorials about spiritual decay and the peasant who poisons royalty. There's even talk, quiet but growing, of excommunication. It's not a small threat. To be excommunicated is to be cast out not just from church, but from heaven, from salvation itself. It's the ultimate punishment, short of death. But Rasputin doesn't blink. He starts referring to himself, half jokingly maybe, as the Black Monk. When someone asks what it means, he just grins. "There are white sheep in heaven," he says. "I am the wolf that guards the gate." And then the war starts. August 1914. Russia plunges into World War I with banners waving and priests blessing bayonets. For a moment, Rasputin fades into the background. The country has bigger things to fear. Or so they think. Because while men bleed in trenches, Rasputin remains at the Empress's side. Nicholas goes to the front. He wants to command personally. A noble gesture, perhaps, but it leaves Alexandra in charge back home, and Alexandra trusts no one. Except Rasputin. He begins recommending appointments, suggesting dismissals. A general here, a minister there. Each decision strange, each one whispered through Rasputin's teeth. And the church? They see it all. They watch a mystic peasant, now branded heretic and possibly possessed, begin reshaping the empire from inside a woman's grief. They pray, they plot, they start digging into every sermon Rasputin ever gave, looking for official heresies, direct contradictions to Scripture. They find plenty. He said that sin is a path to grace, that the soul is strongest when the flesh is weakest, that angels dance among drunkards more than monks. In one written note, crumpled and wine-stained, he even scrawled, "To deny the pleasures of the body is to insult the hands that made it." That one makes 3 bishops choke on their tea. And then there are the drawings. crude sketches. Not quite pornographic, but suggestive. Rasputin's own hand, found in a drawer, accompanied by strange prayers in half Russian, half gibberish. Are they confessions, spells, drunken jokes? No one knows, but the church files them away like evidence at a trial that hasn't happened yet. And yet, still, he endures. At this point, it's not about faith anymore. It's about survival. Rasputin's survival, yes, but also the Tsarina's, the dynasties, because the bleeding boy is still alive. And every time he hurts, Rasputin helps. One bishop, when asked why they haven't acted more forcefully, replies simply, "You do not exorcise the bridge while you're still crossing it." But make no mistake, the exorcism is coming. A group of priests begins drafting a formal edict. Words like heretic, blasphemer, and devil in cassock appear. They prepare to submit it to the synod. And Rasputin. He writes a letter. To no one? Or maybe to God. It says, "Let them curse me. I was never trying to be holy. Only helpful. Only true. The rest is wind." It ends with a drawing. A spiral. Tight and dark with teeth along the edges. By the time anyone reads it, he's already back in the palace. Laughing, drinking, and whispering in the ear of an empress who now trusts him more than she trusts her own prayers. The great halls of Petrograd are heavy with perfume and paranoia. Ministers bow, eyes darting to shadowed corners. The empress glides past portraits of old czars, her hands clasped tightly, whispering to herself in German. And somewhere, behind a silk curtain, beneath a gilt arch, maybe in the pantry drinking from a bottle half hidden in his robes, Rasputin watches it all. By now he's less a man and more a myth in motion. He no longer knocks. He appears. He no longer requests. He advises. And if you don't listen, well, things have a way of going wrong. Let's talk about that. A certain general, respected, polished, not exactly a fan of barefoot prophets, makes the mistake of questioning Rasputin's influence. Publicly. The next day, he's dismissed. The day after that, he slips on a staircase and breaks his leg in 3 places. Someone jokes that Rasputin hexed him. No one laughs too hard. Because at this point, people aren't sure what Rasputin is. A healer? A manipulator? A sorcerer with bad hygiene? Even the church has stopped trying to define him. Instead, they've started studying him like a contagion, tracking his patterns, his visitors, his wine deliveries. And they're worried. Because Rasputin's power isn't just mystical, it's administrative. He's meddling in appointments. Ministers rise and fall by his words. Alexandra trusts him absolutely, and her influence, while the Tsar is at the front, has expanded like spilled ink. Rasputin is now recommending who runs the Interior Ministry, the War Office, even the church itself. Yes, really. He begins inserting his own chosen priests into key parishes, men who talk like him, smell like him, and, according to one bishop, preach like the devil after a long nap. You can see how the church might find this upsetting. But Rasputin doesn't care. Or maybe he cares too much and expresses it through chaos. Either way, he mocks the church openly now, at dinner parties, in salons. Once, when a priest scolds him for his behavior, Rasputin allegedly replies, "You worship gold. I worship God. And only one of us walks barefoot." It's a zinger, no doubt, but also deeply inconvenient when you're trying to maintain theological order in a country tearing itself apart. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By 1915, Rasputin was openly advising the Tsarina on matters of state, leading to widespread accusations of political interference and undermining of the government. And your fringe tidbit. Rasputin believed that staring directly at a candle flame for 10 minutes could allow you to hear the thoughts of birds. When asked if he'd actually done it, he replied, "Yes." They are very opinionated. Meanwhile, Russia is cracking. The war has gone badly. Food is scarce. Bread lines wrap around buildings. Soldiers die by the tens of thousands. And at home, the people begin to whisper, "Why is a peasant running the empire?" Posters appear in alleyways. Caricatures of Rasputin as a puppet master. Strings tied to the empress and the child heir. His beard is exaggerated. His eyes are red. Flames curl around his feet. It's not just satire, it's hate. Pamphlets circulate, accusing Rasputin of treason, of seducing the empress, of selling secrets to the Germans. Some claim he's the Antichrist. Others say he's just a drunk with lucky timing. Both sides agree he must go. But how? The church has tried sermons, letters, threats, even dreams probably. Nothing sticks. Because Rasputin is protected by two things: Alexandra's unshakable faith and an uncanny ability to survive. He's been poisoned, beaten, stabbed, and somehow every time he walks away, grinning, limping, but breathing. It's starting to feel personal. So the church tries a new tactic. Humiliation? They spread stories, some true, some creatively interpreted. One tale claims Rasputin once wandered into a church during Mass, interrupted the sermon, and yelled, "God is drunk and so am I," before kissing a nun on the cheek and leaving. Another says he anointed a government official by spitting on his forehead. These stories spread like wildfire. The point isn't truth. The point is erosion. Undermine the legend. Make him ridiculous. But Rasputin, bizarrely, embraces the chaos. He laughs at the rumors, adds his own, tells a group of socialites that he once spoke to a painting of Christ, and the painting blinked. When they ask if it happened in a church, he shrugs and says, "No, it was in a brothel." At this point, it's unclear whether he's trying to get excommunicated or trying to become folklore. Historians still argue whether Rasputin's erratic behavior was intentional, weaponized eccentricity, or just the natural end of a man who believed too deeply in his own myth. Either way, it's working, because the church is cornered. They can't kill him. They can't control him. And the more they scream demon, the more people start to think, maybe that's what it takes to protect a dying empire. Maybe the saints already had their chance. And then there's the bleeding boy. Because every time the church prepares a new decree, a new condemnation, another miracle occurs. Alexei falls. A knee swells. A fever spikes. The doctors panic. Alexandra prays. And Rasputin, whether in person or through telegram, responds with a few words. He will live. Let God do his work. And again, somehow, the boy recovers. It's infuriating. It's terrifying. It's enough to make a bishop question the laws of physics. One priest writes in his journal, "I do not know what Rasputin is, but I fear he is something we deserve." And still, Rasputin walks the halls, sings in the baths, tells fortunes to chambermaids, eats fish with his hands, speaks of heaven as if he's been there and didn't much care for the decor. But beneath it all, even Rasputin can feel it. The walls are closing in. The jokes are getting meaner, the glances sharper, the silence heavier. He begins telling friends, "I see smoke in my dreams, not fire. Smoke, as if something has already burned and no one noticed." And then, quietly, he says something strange to Alexandra. "If I die wrong, everything falls." She doesn't ask what that means. She just clutches her cross tighter. The ballrooms are quieter now. Less laughter, more whispers. Petrograd's noble salons, once loud with gossip and silver clinking in fine crystal, have become echo chambers of dread. The air feels heavy. The portraits on the walls seem to watch more intently. And still, Rasputin endures. He isn't supposed to be here anymore. Not after the sermons, not after the pamphlets, not after the stabbing, not after the Tsar's own advisors begged him to be sent away. But he remains, like smoke, like a stain that can't be scrubbed out of silk. Even the walls of the church now seem to close in on themselves. At a private gathering of senior clergy, one archbishop says aloud, "If we name him a demon, we must then ask, why do so many call him Savior?" No one answers. Because the truth is, Rasputin occupies a space that theology was never designed to hold. He isn't just a sinner. He isn't a saint. He's something else. A man who bends holy words until they hum like wires under tension. A man who touches pain and calls it prayer. A man who walks drunk into confession and emerges, somehow, forgiven. Now, let's get a little scandalous. There's a dinner party. Lavish. Caviar, crystal, fur stoles brushing over velvet chairs. And then he walks in. Rasputin, robes rumpled, beard matted, eyes glowing with that familiar feverish shine. No invitation, just walks in. One noblewoman tells him he smells of horses. He tells her she smells of judgment. And then he blesses her forehead with 2 fingers, murmurs something in a dialect no one understands, and walks away chuckling. She faints 10 minutes later. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe just good timing. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By late 1915, Rasputin's growing influence over both political and spiritual matters reached a point where he was widely seen as a destabilizing force, one some ministers believed had to be removed for the monarchy to survive. And your fringe tidbit. Rasputin believed cucumbers could ward off evil dreams. He used to sleep with one under his pillow to keep the shadows from entering. When asked once why a cucumber, he blinked slowly and said, "It's a very honest vegetable." Moving on. The church has now fully turned against him. There are active efforts to discredit him. Public petitions, leaked letters, priests writing to each other in desperate, ink-blotted handwriting about spiritual disease taking root in the palace. And yet Rasputin seems utterly unfazed. In fact, he gets worse. He starts showing up at Mass unannounced, stands at the back, never kneels, doesn't cross himself, just watches. Once during a sermon, he begins laughing, quietly at first, then louder. When asked afterward what was so funny, he says, "They speak of salvation like it's a door with a lock. I already walked through the wall." And it's not just the clergy he unnerves. One noble claims Rasputin walked into his home, looked at a portrait on the wall, and said, "That man's bones are cold." The man in the painting had died 3 days earlier. No one had told Rasputin. He makes children cry without touching them. He makes dogs whimper. He makes guards who've served 20 years look twice over their shoulders on patrol. And yet, in the Empress's presence, he is gentle, soft-spoken, calm. He prays beside her, assures her the war will turn, that Alexei's pain is not punishment, but preparation, that they are chosen. That suffering is a crown in disguise. It's intoxicating, really. This theology of pain as purpose, it makes Rasputin more than a healer. It makes him a prophet of resilience. Historians still argue whether Alexandra's attachment to him was faith, desperation, or both braided into something too tight to untangle. But the church doesn't argue anymore. They act. They begin the formal drafting of an anathema, a total spiritual condemnation, not just excommunication. This is worse. a declaration that Rasputin is cut off from grace, cursed by the church, marked by heaven as an enemy of the faith. It's rare, reserved for the worst heretics, and the last time one was declared in Russia, it was against a man who claimed to be the second coming. But even this move divides the church. Because how do you denounce a man the Empress calls the light in our darkness? How do you remove someone who doesn't answer to doctrine, but to visions? Worse still, how do you do it when every time you speak against him, something goes wrong? One bishop, bold and theatrical, prepares to deliver the first public reading of the anathema. The night before, lightning strikes the steeple of his cathedral. Coincidence? Certainly. Probably. Almost definitely. Still, he postpones, then cancels. And Rasputin keeps smiling. He gives blessings to drunkards on the street. He wipes tears from washerwomen. He tells a stable boy that his fever will break if he eats pickled cabbage and prays with his left hand. It does. None of this should work, but it keeps working. So now the whispers begin to curdle into something darker. Not from the church this time, but from elsewhere. From the palace kitchens, the officers' mess halls, the back rooms of smoky cafes. If the church can't stop him, maybe someone else can. And Rasputin? He feels it, like a wolf smelling the first snow. He begins writing more frequently. Rambling notes, letters, prophecies scrawled on scraps of paper. Some make it to Alexandria. Others are burned by servants who don't want to be part of whatever comes next. He tells a visiting priest, "If I am killed by peasants, the throne will hold. But if I fall by noble hands, blood will run like water." That priest, by the way, reportedly refused to sleep indoors for 3 nights after hearing that. Because Rasputin doesn't just talk now, he warns. And somewhere behind all the smoke and wine and holy mutterings is the quiet truth the church doesn't want to admit. They don't know if he's lying. Snow falls like silence over Petrograd. Thick, slow, dreamlike. A kind of hush blankets the rooftops, broken only by the distant rattle of a cartwheel or the soft groan of a cathedral bell. It should feel peaceful. Instead, it feels like the city is holding its breath. Inside, behind gilded doors and frosted windows, priests light candles and speak in low voices. The Holy Synod has reached a verdict. Rasputin is not merely misguided, not simply blasphemous. No. The new word, whispered in Latin, etched in official parchment, echoed in church halls across the empire, is anathema. He is declared outside the light of Christ, a soul in rebellion, a corruption in the body of the church. And yet, he walks the streets like nothing happened. Because here's the maddening part. Rasputin doesn't need the church's light. He's been burning from within this whole time. The declaration isn't read publicly at first. Too risky, too political. But the clergy begins to act accordingly. Churches where Rasputin once prayed now close their doors when he passes. Priests who once entertained his visions now leave the room when he speaks. One priest reportedly crosses himself backward when Rasputin enters. He says he did it by accident. No one believes him. And Rasputin. He just smiles wider. One night, a clergyman throws a goblet of holy water at Rasputin during a public blessing. Rasputin doesn't flinch. He just shakes the water from his beard like a wet dog and says, "You forgot the wine." Here's your mainstream historical fact. Rasputin was never formally excommunicated by the Russian Orthodox Church, but several bishops called publicly for his removal and spiritual condemnation, and private documentation suggests the church labeled him a heretical threat in internal communications. And your fringe tidbit. Rasputin believed his own heartbeat could be used as a compass. "It speeds up when I'm close to someone who hates me," he once told a servant. slows when I'm near the innocent. The servant later claimed it never beat normally around mirrors. Now the people are starting to fracture. For some, Rasputin is the last candle flickering in the wind, a mystic who sees what others won't, who speaks truth from the gutter and heals with the touch of a sinner's hand. For others, he is poison, a drunken fraud, a charlatan wrapped in a monk's rags, a danger to the throne and the faith. And both sides have begun to sharpen their words into weapons. Pamphlets printed in secret basements accuse him of consorting with witches, of invoking pagan gods under full moons, of seducing the empress, not just in heart, but in flesh, of keeping a lock of her hair inside his boot. Most of this is nonsense, some of it is not. Historians still argue whether Rasputin and Alexandra Romanova ever had a physical relationship. There's no proof, only letters. Strange, devotional, sometimes uncomfortably intimate letters. Our friend, she calls him, my light, the man through whom God listens. If you squint, it's faith. If you stare, it starts to feel like something else. And now, with the church branding him cursed, and society split in love and hatred, the palace begins to feel like a trap. Guards whisper prayers when they pass Rasputin. Servants cross themselves twice. One even leaves a small bag of salt under the empress's door to keep the spirits out. Salt against a man. There are no sermons powerful enough to undo what's been done. Rasputin has wormed his way into the heart of the most sacred institution in Russia, the royal bloodline. And the church, with all its power, has found itself helpless. So they lean into the only thing they have left, prophecy. In an obscure monastery outside Kazan, a monk known for his visions, Yakov the Barefoot, begins warning visitors that a false saint rides the tide of war. He tells pilgrims that a man will die beneath the snow, and with him, so too will fall the great eagle. Word gets around. Rasputin hears it. Of course he does. He starts quoting the prophecy himself. Beneath the snow, he says at a dinner party, I will sleep, and then they will see the sky turn red. A general chokes on his soup. You'd think the church would be satisfied. After all, Rasputin has now been publicly denounced, branded spiritually dangerous, cut off from the sacred rites. But instead of shrinking, he expands. His mystique grows. There's something perversely appealing about a man who defies bishops and lives, about someone who walks into the center of holiness and flicks the incense smoke aside like it's just fog. One bishop tries to give a sermon warning against him. A rat scurries across the altar during communion. The bishop faints. Coincidence? You're free to decide, but people start whispering about plagues, about divine punishment, about unholy favor. The phrase blessed by the devil shows up in a priest's journal, circled 3 times in red ink. And Rasputin. He starts dreaming of blood. He writes to Alexandra, I see wolves at the door of the palace, not wolves of the body but of soul. If I fall, they enter. Guard the boy. Guard him not with prayer, but with silence. She clutches the letter to her chest. Sleep becomes impossible. And one day, while Rasputin sits beside the boy's bed, whispering a prayer made of 3 languages and none, he pauses, looks at Alexei, then says softly, I think I've made them afraid. I think I've made the wrong ones afraid. That evening, he walks the snowy gardens alone. His boots leave deep prints. The wind howls. Someone watches from the trees. They never speak. But Rasputin stops, turns, smiles, then keeps walking. And behind him, the snow fills his footprints like he was never there at all. There's a chill in the air that has nothing to do with winter. Petrograd has become a city of locked doors, furrowed brows, and unfinished prayers. Ministers pace in thick boots. Generals mutter in corridors. Priests, once bold, now glance over their shoulders before they speak the name. Rasputin. They no longer call him monk or mystic or peasant. Now they call him puppet master. Because even if the church has condemned him, even if society grumbles like a thundercloud ready to burst, Rasputin still moves pieces, still shifts power. It's subtle, infuriating, and everywhere. A governor falls ill. Rasputin visits. 3 days later, the man resigns. A new one is appointed. A man Rasputin once blessed with the words, "Your hands are made for holding pens, not knives." Nobody knows what it means, but everyone understands who gave the order. You see, Alexandra is more than loyal. She is devout. And Rasputin, despite the church's fire and fury, is still her closest advisor. Her holy man. Her comfort in war, grief, and uncertainty. And that terrifies the aristocracy. Because it's not just that Rasputin is there. It's that they can't stop him from being there. The church begins to lose ground, not spiritually, but politically. Their decrees are ignored, their warnings mocked. One particularly brave bishop writes a sermon titled, "The False Prophet and the Hollow Crown." By sunrise, he's removed from his post. Officially, illness. Unofficially, Rasputin smiled when he heard the news. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By 1916, Rasputin was so entwined in imperial politics that several high-ranking government officials resigned in protest of his influence, stating openly that Russia's stability was threatened by a man without office or accountability. And your fringe tidbit. Rasputin believed the moon was jealous of candles. He claimed moonlight was the sorrow of God's eye, and refused to sleep in full moonlight. "It knows too much," he once muttered. Now imagine this. You're a noble. You've served 3 czars. You've studied military strategy, theology, diplomacy, and suddenly you find yourself begging your empress not to listen to a man who blesses cucumbers and drinks wine from a boot. And she tells you, "He saved my son. He speaks with heaven. Leave us." So you leave, and Rasputin stays. That kind of power, unchallenged, unelected, unholy, is the sort that makes empires wobble. And wobble it does. The war drags on. Soldiers desert. Food vanishes. Bread riots flare. And rumors swirl that the Tsarina, German-born, is plotting with Rasputin to surrender to the Kaiser. It isn't true, but that doesn't matter anymore. The idea of Rasputin is now more dangerous than the man himself. And even he knows it. He starts muttering things like, "They will kill me with silk hands." He writes cryptic letters to Alexandra, to old friends, to no one. Notes that say things like, "The bear has eaten honey from too many fingers. Now it cannot tell which ones bleed." What does that mean? No one knows. But one minister is said to have burned a copy in his fireplace out of sheer unease. Rasputin begins to walk with a slight limp. Not from injury, but weariness. As though gravity pulls harder around him now. He spends less time in salons, more in churches that haven't banned him, or in his home, where candles burn too low and too many. He tells a stable boy, "The world is turning like milk. It will curdle soon." Meanwhile, the church holds secret meetings. No robes, no icons, just whispers and clenched fists. They debate drastic measures, not just condemnation, elimination. But that idea doesn't start in the church. It starts among the nobles. They've had enough. Enough of this mystic breathing down the neck of the monarchy. Enough of this wolf in a shepherd's robe. Enough of bloodlines being guarded by visions and shadows. And so, behind closed doors, a plot is born. A coalition of nobles, officers, and even a few quiet church supporters come together. Names like Yusupov, Purishkevich, Dmitry Pavlovich, Men of wealth, title, and desperation. Their mission? Kill Rasputin. Not to punish him. To save Russia. At least, that's what they tell themselves. Historians still argue whether the plot was driven by patriotism, jealousy, fear, or something more primal. Because to those in power, Rasputin isn't just a danger, he's a mirror, and they don't like what they see reflected back. Weakness, dependence, failure. The plan is simple. Lure him. Poison him. Finish the job if the poison fails. But Rasputin, being Rasputin, complicates even murder. In the days leading up to the attempt, he becomes serene. He visits the cathedral, the same one where he was once called a wound in the body of Christ. He lights a candle anyway, kneels in silence. A young priest asks what he's praying for. Rasputin replies, for the next world to be less confused than this one. And then he leaves, brushing the snow off his robe, humming a hymn no one recognizes. He attends a final dinner, laughs too loudly, drinks too much, hugs a general who once swore he'd kill him, tells a joke about saints and sausages that no one understands. And then he says, soon they will say I'm gone, but watch the fire. It always leaves smoke. That night, he walks home through the snow. The lamp above his door flickers once, twice, then stays lit. It's late, cold in a way that feels personal. The streets of Petrograd are hushed, coated in a soft blanket of new snow, pure, untouched, waiting. And somewhere in the flickering lamplight of an opulent basement on the Moika River, a man pours poison into a slice of cake. Not metaphorical poison, actual cyanide, enough to kill 3 men. The man is Prince Felix Yusupov, aristocrat, aesthete, occasional crossdresser, and now self-appointed savior of the Russian Empire. His hands don't tremble. He wants to believe he's calm, but beneath the silk cuffs of his shirt, he's sweating. He thinks of Russia, of Alexandra's sunken eyes, of the general's muttered threats, of Rasputin's grinning, unblinking stare, and he thinks, this is mercy. He is wrong. Let's pause here. Because you already know how this ends, right? Rasputin dies. He has to. History says so. But it doesn't happen quickly, or cleanly, or anything like anyone expects. Back in that elegant house under crystal chandeliers, the trap is set. Candles are lit. Wine is poured. And Yusupov waits. He's invited Rasputin under the pretense of meeting his wife, Irina. Young, beautiful, powerful. The mystic, reportedly intrigued, agrees. Vanity, they say, was always his Achilles' heel. He arrives late, wearing his usual shapeless coat and smelling faintly of tobacco and church incense. His beard is damp from snow. He seems tired, older, quieter, but still smiling. Yusupov leads him downstairs to the waiting room, brightly lit, comfortable, and unnaturally cheerful. On the table, petit fours laced with cyanide, sweet wine, more cyanide. Rasputin eats. Nothing happens. 10 minutes pass, then 20. Yusupov starts to panic. Rasputin is supposed to be dead by now. Instead, he leans back, compliments the decor, and begins singing. Off-key, cheerful, a peasant folk tune. Here's your mainstream historical fact. On the night of December 29th, Old Style, or December 16th, 1916, Rasputin was lured to Yusupov's palace, where multiple assassination methods were employed, including poisoning, shooting, and ultimately drowning. And your fringe tidbit. One of the conspirators later claimed Rasputin had blessed the cake before eating it. He said it was rude to eat without thanking the spirits, the man whispered years later. Maybe that's why the poison didn't work. Yusupov, now shaking, excuses himself. He goes upstairs to confer with his co-conspirators. The poison has failed. And Rasputin, still downstairs, still humming, still very much alive. So they try something more, direct. Yusupov returns, this time with a revolver. Rasputin stands to say goodbye and is shot in the chest. He falls. Finally, silence. Yusupov leans in, watches the blood spread. A sigh escapes his lips. It's done. But it isn't. Minutes later, just as the nobles upstairs begin to toast the death of the devil, a sound. A wheeze. A shuffle. Rasputin gets up. Bleeding. Groaning. Eyes wide with something not quite human. He lunges at Yusupov, grasping, muttering words no one understands. He makes it to the door. He gets outside. The snow is falling harder now, muffling everything but the sound of his boots dragging across the courtyard. He's trying to escape, to reach the gate, the river. That's when they shoot him again. And again. One bullet strikes his head. He falls. This time they're sure. Just to be safe, they tie him in a rug, drag him to the frozen Neva River, and drop him through a hole in the ice. Let the water take him. Let the cold finish what bullets and poison couldn't. 3 days later, his body is found. His hands are open, his face pale, his lungs full of water, which means he was still breathing when he hit the river. Historians still argue whether this was true, if he truly survived poison, bullets, and only drowned at the end, or if the details were embellished. But one autopsy note reads clearly, signs of water inhalation present. Let that sink in. They poisoned him. They shot him. They beat him. And still, the river had the final word. Word of Rasputin's death spreads like thunder. Some weep, some drink, some cross themselves with relief. The church holds no official service, no bells, no mourning, just a quiet, subtle shift, like an exhale they'd been holding for too long. But the Empress? She collapses. She screams, locks herself away, refuses food, refuses counsel, refuses the church. Alexei cries for hours. He does not understand. He only knows his healer is gone. Nicholas returns from the front. He is tired, older. He stares at his wife and says only, "It has begun then." Because Rasputin may be dead, but the fault lines he held together with wine and prayer and prophecy, they're opening. Within 2 months, the monarchy will collapse. The Romanovs will be imprisoned. A year later, they will be dead. The eagle will fall. And the blood Rasputin foretold will flow in rivers no winter can freeze. Back at the Neva, the ice closes, as if it never broke. As if the man who wouldn't die never lived at all. The cathedral bells ring louder now, not in celebration, but in something closer to alarm. Petrograd holds its breath as winter deepens and the empire creaks like an old door before the wind. The man they call Demon is gone, murdered, dumped in ice. And yet, somehow it's not quieter without him. It's worse. Because without Rasputin, the strange balance he maintained, between chaos and control, between superstition and stability, has shattered. The Empress refuses to accept it. She walks the halls of the palace in silence, clutching a prayer book she no longer opens. Her eyes are swollen. She says nothing during meals. Her hands tremble when she touches Alexei's hair. The boy doesn't speak for 2 days after Rasputin's death. Not a word. When he finally does, it's just a whisper. "Where did our friend go?" No one answers. And the church? You'd think they'd be celebrating, but they're not. Because Rasputin's death, rather than silencing his legend, has fed it. People say the river froze harder that week, that birds didn't sing, that wolves came closer to town than usual. One servant swears she saw a vision of him in a puddle, smiling up at her, mouthing words she couldn't hear. Even some priests hesitate to speak his name now, because yes, he's dead, but he didn't die right. Too slow, too strange, too many witnesses saying he should have been dead hours before the water took him. One deacon, when asked what he thought, said only, "Holy men die quietly. He did not die. He fought." And maybe that's the problem. Rasputin didn't go out like a heretic, or a fraud, or a madman. He went out like a warning. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Following Rasputin's death in December 1916, the Romanov dynasty lasted less than 3 months before Nicholas II abdicated in March 1917, bringing 300 years of Tsarist rule to an end. And your fringe tidbit. When Rasputin's body was recovered, it was initially buried in secret. But after the revolution, it was exhumed, taken into a field, doused with gasoline, and burned. Eyewitnesses claim the body sat upright in the flames as if trying to escape. Make of that what you will. The nobility, of course, denies everything. Prince Yusupov is exiled, sent to Crimea. Later, he flees to Europe, publishes a book, and lives into old age, haunted by dreams, according to his wife. Dreams where Rasputin stands in the snow laughing, holding a child's bleeding hand. Purishkevich, one of the other conspirators, spirals into fanaticism. He gives speeches about saving Russia with blood and fire, but dies of typhus in a railway car, babbling about shadows. And the church? They don't speak of him officially again. No trials, no posthumous excommunication, nothing. Just a silence thicker than incense. Historians still argue over the church's silence after Rasputin's death. Was it fear, embarrassment, relief, or a quiet acknowledgement that whatever he was, he had beaten them at their own game? Because make no mistake, Rasputin understood faith. Not the structured kind, not the kind that wears robes and quotes doctrine. The other kind. The kind that burns in desperation, that people whisper in sickness, that clings to candles and old bones and rumors of healing. He gave that to the people, to the empress, to the boy. And no sermon could undo that. In the months that follow, Russia buckles. The Tsar is forced to abdicate. The royal family is placed under house arrest. Revolution sweeps through the streets like wildfire. And in the chaos, Rasputin's name is everywhere. They killed the healer. They angered God. The blood has only begun. And beneath it all, a question that no one dares answer. What if he was right? What if, by killing Rasputin, they cracked open something they couldn't close? Because it's not just the fall of the Romanovs. It's the unraveling of a nation, civil war, mass executions, famine, 100 years of ghosts pouring through the holes he left behind. Back in the village where he was born, Pokrovsko, someone carves a cross into a birch tree. Just his name. No dates, no explanation. It's gone by spring. But others keep the legend alive. In taverns, in whispers, in books and ballads and eerie lullabies sung to children who are told never to speak his name after dark. Because Rasputin didn't just die. He became something. Not a saint, not a villain. Something in between. Something the church still flinches at. One priest puts it best in a letter never meant to be read. We called him a demon. Perhaps that was too easy. Perhaps he was a mirror, and we did not like what we saw. The cathedral smells like dust now. Dust and old wax. No more incense. No more choral echoes rising into stained glass halos. Just dust and silence. Rasputin is gone. The empire is crumbling, and the church, for all its holy rituals and ancient power, is suddenly not in control of the story anymore. because Rasputin's story refuses to end. They tried to bury him, twice actually. The first time quietly, in a churchyard near Tsarskoye Selo, at the Empress's insistence. A private ceremony, few words, no press, no fanfare, just a grave and a name. But the revolutionaries didn't want that grave to exist. After the Tsar abdicates, the Bolsheviks dig it up, drag the coffin into the woods, burn it. No prayers this time, just gasoline and spit, and maybe a nervous joke about devils and how fast they burn. But according to a guard, just a kid 17, Rasputin's body sat up in the flames. Historians chalk it up to muscle contractions, or maybe the heat, or maybe the story was made up entirely. But it sticks, because some figures are too large to lie still. The church doesn't mention the burning, doesn't record it, doesn't acknowledge that the man they called a demon, once cursed in hushed tones and fire and brimstone sermons, has now become a ghost wandering through Russia's darkest hour. And the people, they start visiting his old haunts. Not openly, of course. The Soviet authorities don't allow pilgrimages. But they come, quietly, to the frozen riverbank, to the old wooden house where he once lived, to the last church where he ever lit a candle. They come to leave flowers, to whisper prayers, to ask, just in case, that he still hears them. One woman says her son stopped stuttering after she dreamt of Rasputin touching his forehead. Another claims her arthritis vanished after she rubbed her hands on a tree where he used to pray. It's not canon. It's not blessed. It's not official. It's faith. The messy kind. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The Russian Orthodox Church later attempted to distance itself entirely from the Rasputin affair, calling it a stain upon a sacred institution and citing it as a lesson in the dangers of unchecked spiritual authority. And your fringe tidbit. Some of Rasputin's followers believed he would reincarnate in the 1990s as a red-haired woman. When asked why, they reportedly said, "'Cause he always did the opposite of what you expected." Now that's Rasputin logic if there ever was any. And what of the clergy who tried to stop him? Many disappeared in the revolution. Churches were closed, priests exiled, relics stolen or destroyed. The Holy Synod that once condemned Rasputin was dissolved by the Bolsheviks in 1917. Poetic, really. The man they called a threat to orthodoxy died months before the church itself lost its earthly power. Historians still argue whether Rasputin's rise was a symptom of a dying empire, or the thing that finally killed it. But down in the pews, where real people pray with chapped hands and empty bellies, Rasputin has become something else entirely. Not a demon, not a savior, more like a warning wrapped in a wish. He represents the moment faith turned strange, when people stopped believing in gold crosses and started believing in wild eyes and whispered promises, when desperation became doctrine, and the boundary between holiness and hunger blurred. People remember how he touched their children and the fever broke. They remember the way he said their dead mothers were listening. They remember how, for a while, someone, anyone, seemed to care about the sick, the poor, the afraid. And so they light candles, even when they're told not to, even now. Because Rasputin lives in the places where theology breaks, where no priest has answers, where the pain won't stop and the doctors have left, and all you have is a splintered icon and a whispered name, Grigory. The church doesn't talk about him anymore. But in a quiet church outside Yekaterinburg, an old nun keeps a portrait of him hidden behind a curtain, not to worship, just to remember. She once said he was wrong, but he wasn't all wrong. When asked what she meant, she replied, "He touched something holy with dirty hands, and sometimes that's the only way anyone touches it at all." The church calls him a demon. The state calls him a threat. The revolutionaries call him a symptom. But the people? They're not so sure. Out in the countryside, far from Petrograd's broken palaces and blood-slicked staircases, Rasputin's name is still spoken at night. Not loud, not with pride, but with a certain cautious reverence. You hear it in old prayers, in stories told to children by candlelight. You hear it when a child is sick and no priest can come, and the mother kneels anyway, clutching an old scrap of cloth and whispering a prayer that starts, "Our friend, hear us still." And yet, to the clergy, he remains something shameful, unclean, untouchable, a bruise they'd rather not explain. They issue no canonization, obviously, no sainthood, no formal recognition, but they also stop issuing condemnations, because to do so would be to admit how badly they lost control, how badly they misjudged the people's hunger for something immediate, something imperfect, something real. And Rasputin? He was real. Too real. He didn't quote scripture. He hummed it. He didn't sit behind altars. He crashed weddings, wandered into barns, laid hands on peasants and princes alike. His gospel was sloppy. Flesh and wine and wild prayers. His theology was crooked, but it worked. At least, sometimes. That's what made him dangerous. Not his sins. His success. Here's your mainstream historical fact. After the fall of the monarchy, the Soviet regime banned most religious practice, and priests were imprisoned or executed. Yet in villages, folk saints, including Rasputin, began to occupy the space once held by canonical figures. And your fringe tidbit. In one tiny Siberian village, locals reportedly carved a wooden statue of Rasputin in the 1930s. Not to worship, but to ward off churchmen with cold eyes. It was burned by a passing Red Army patrol. The villagers built another, smaller. They hid it in a barn. Meanwhile, scholars start to pick at the mystery. In Europe and America, books begin to appear. Titles like The Mad Monk, The Holy Devil, The Seducer of the Tsarina. He's painted as a hypnotist, a sex maniac, a fraud, a prophet, a peasant Houdini, a mystic with goat breath and ice blue eyes. He becomes entertainment, caricature, punchline. And yet, none of them can quite agree on what he was. Some say he used hypnosis. Others claim herbal concoctions. Some believe he had access to rare medical knowledge. A few insist he was simply in the right place at the wrong time with terrifying charisma. Historians still argue whether Rasputin's ability to calm the Tsarevich's bleeding episodes was real, placebo, or sheer coincidence. But here's the twist. It doesn't matter anymore. Because even if none of it was true, enough people believed it. And belief, as any priest knows, is harder to kill than truth. Somewhere in a basement archive, an old priest reviewing records scribbles this note in the margin of a report on Rasputin's death. We did not fear his evil. We feared that God listened to him more than us. There it is. The wound. Because Rasputin was dirty, undisciplined, laughing. And still, the divine seemed to whisper to him in alleyways and sick rooms and stables, while the church's voice echoed in marble and faded. You want to know why they called him a demon? It wasn't because he sinned. It was because he sinned and still healed. He sinned and people followed. He sinned and they called him holy. And that shattered everything. One night in 1921, a young seminarian studying theology in secret under the early Soviet regime wrote in a letter to his sister, "If Rasputin had bathed more often and quoted Aquinas, he would be a saint today." She never replied. The seminarian disappeared 2 months later, but his letter survived. So did the story. Not the official version, not the church's version, the version whispered by candlelight, The version told in back kitchens, under breath, by grandmothers who look around before they speak. The version where Rasputin wasn't just a demon. He was a mirror. And the church. They didn't like what they saw in it. Because what they saw wasn't evil. It was power, uncontrolled, unwashed, and terrifyingly real. Yeah. The war ends. The empire is dust. The Romanovs are gone. Shot in a basement, their bodies buried and burned, their faces scraped out of old portraits like history itself is trying to forget them. And yet Rasputin lingers. Not in body, that's long gone. Burned, scattered, erased. But in memory, he's just getting started. The new Soviet state, atheist to its bones, bans religion, tears down icons, turns churches into warehouses and dance halls. But even they can't quite get rid of him. Because Rasputin doesn't belong to the church anymore. He belongs to everyone else. He's become a ghost that refuses to follow dogma. A walking contradiction the church couldn't tame, and the revolution couldn't silence. A holy man with no holiness, a sinner who healed, a dead man who won't stop showing up. In whispered tales, in underground gatherings, in peasant prayers and drunken songs. His name becomes a spell, not always a kind one. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Despite the Soviet Union's ban on religion, rural communities in the 1920s and 30s continued to share oral folk stories about Rasputin as a healer, a trickster, or a martyr, sometimes blending him with local saints and even pre-Christian forest spirits. And your fringe tidbit. Some peasants claimed that if you whispered Grigori 3 times into a mirror at midnight, he'd appear behind you in the glass, eyes glowing, waiting to see if you were bleeding anywhere. Yeah, that one never made it into any seminary textbooks. But let's be clear, the church was done with him. Publicly, anyway. Privately? That's where things get strange. Because years later, tucked in the margins of obscure theological texts, you find scattered notes, bits of unease, priests asking questions they're not supposed to ask, letters mentioning dreams, apparitions, the smell of burning wax where none was lit. One particularly nervous deacon in 1936 wrote, "I awoke to find my candle snuffed out, but the room smelled of incense and wet fur." No follow-up. No explanation. Just that. Historians still argue whether these notes reflect real sightings, superstitions, or stress-induced hallucinations. But something about Rasputin, his defiance, his hunger, his bizarre magnetism gets into people's bones, especially the clergy. Because whether they want to admit it or not, he touched the sacred. With dirty hands, yes, with a full belly and a half-empty wine bottle, but still, he touched it. And that burns. One modern Russian theologian, speaking anonymously, once said, "He forced us to confront something we hated, that maybe the sacred doesn't look how we want it to. Maybe it's not clean. Maybe it laughs too loud." That doesn't preach well on Sundays, but it lingers. And now, outside the church's once golden grip, Rasputin begins to evolve. He becomes folklore, a shapeshifter, a wandering monk who shows up at crossroads and tells you which path leads to safety and which leads to wolves. A prophet whose bones still dream beneath frozen rivers. A sinner God listened to because no one else would. In books, he becomes cartoonish, a villain with hypnotic eyes, a sorcerer, a madman, animated with magic, madness, and matted hair. In films, he slithers and shouts and grins through madness. The church hates these portrayals because they strip the context. They make him fiction, easier to dismiss. But the people? They keep remembering the other Rasputin. The one who walked barefoot in the snow and laid hands on their children and spoke of God not like a distant king, but like a familiar ache. a sore tooth, a full moon rising behind your ribs. He wasn't doctrine. He was desperation with a pulse. He was faith that didn't ask for permission. And the church, bound by robes and rules, could never hold that. And they still do. That's why they never put up a plaque. That's why no one ever formally exorcised his memory. Because you can excommunicate a man, but you can't excommunicate a legend. Not one that bled like Rasputin did. Not one that laughed at sermons. Not one that turned holy water into wine just by standing too close to the altar. He was not what they prayed for, but he was exactly what they feared. And he knew it. He once said, "If I were clean, they would ignore me. If I were quiet, they would forget me. But now they will never stop looking over their shoulder." And they haven't. The priest pauses mid-sermon. He feels it again, that cold breath down the back of his neck. No draft, no open windows, just that same unwelcome chill, like someone is standing too close behind him, listening. He doesn't turn around. He never does. Because Rasputin is dead, buried, burned, gone. And yet, not. There are places in Russia, villages half swallowed by forests, chapels with cracked bells, monasteries so remote they whisper instead of sing, where the old monks still keep a candle lit for someone they refuse to name. They don't pray to him, but they don't speak against him either, because they've learned what happens when you try to exorcise something that refuses to leave. The church never issued an official ritual to cleanse Rasputin's presence. How could they? What prayer do you say over a man whose very theology was an insult wrapped in a miracle? They called him demon, but even demons obey some rules. Rasputin didn't. He wasn't chaos for chaos's sake. He wasn't out to destroy the church. He just didn't care if it broke while he walked through it. He once said, "If your God can't handle me, perhaps he is too small." You can see how that rubbed a few people the wrong way, especially those with crosses on their collars. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In the decades after Rasputin's death, the Russian Orthodox Church avoided public discussion of his legacy, treating him as a scandal rather than a historical figure. An embarrassment too recent and too strange to explain. And your fringe tidbit. In 1978, a Russian Orthodox priest in exile in Paris claimed during a private gathering that he once saw Rasputin in a dream, standing behind the altar, wearing priest's robes, laughing. "You never let me in," Rasputin told him. "So I made my own church." There's no record of the dream in any official diary, but two guests at the gathering remembered it. Word got around. And for a while, no one used that altar. Because fear does funny things to theology. Rasputin's church, of course, never existed. Not in the formal sense. No structure, no hierarchy, no hymnal. Just a trail of healed children, weeping nobles, broken doctrine, and people left wondering what just happened. And still today, even among the most traditional clergy, there's a hesitance when his name comes up. He didn't die like a heretic. He didn't even die like a man. He died like a myth that refused to fit inside the walls of orthodoxy. And that myth is still growing. A century later, Rasputin's image appears on t-shirts, shot glasses, and bizarre animated films. He's a cartoon, a joke, a punchline. But in old houses where the wallpaper peels and the floors creak like bones, his name is still spoken softly. Like a warning, like a prayer. Historians still argue over what he really believed. Some say he used religion like a stage. Others say he truly felt the presence of God. One scholar theorized that Rasputin may have suffered from temporal lobe epilepsy, which can produce spiritual visions, charisma, and an altered sense of destiny. And yet, none of this explains how a man like him walked into palaces, and left bishops shaking. None of it explains why the Tsarina wept for weeks, or why a bleeding boy lived when no one expected him to. It doesn't explain why, even now, his name causes rooms to go quiet. Because Rasputin broke the rules. He was supposed to be the villain. Instead, he became something worse. A question no one can answer. Did God truly speak to him? Was he chosen? Cursed? Did he manipulate a desperate mother? Or did he stand, barefoot and filthy, in the burning heart of an empire and offer the one thing no priest, no general, no czar could give? Hope. Not clean hope. Not sweet hope, but raw, bloody, wild hope. The kind that sings in back alleys. The kind that kneels beside deathbeds. The kind that survives fire. One priest wrote many years later, in a torn page hidden inside the cover of his psalter, if he was a demon, then he was the kind that we made, the kind we needed, the kind that spoke when heaven had gone silent. And maybe that's it. Maybe Rasputin wasn't heaven's mistake. Maybe he was ours. A reflection of everything the church didn't want to see. Weakness, powerlessness, mess, doubt, and fire. He did not belong, so they cast him out. But the strange thing about fire, it doesn't need to belong. It just burns. In a back corner of an antique shop in Irkutsk, buried under postcards and faded war medals, sits a small cracked icon. The paint is flaking, the frame chipped, but the face is unmistakable. Not Christ, not a saint, but Rasputin? It's not labeled, not for sale. The shopkeeper won't speak about it. Ask twice, and he'll ask you to leave. Because even now, 100 years on, Rasputin's presence makes people nervous. Not just the church, not just the historians, but the everyday folks who light candles, whisper old prayers, and aren't entirely convinced that what died in that icy river was just a man. Because here's the strange truth. He won. Not in life. He was humiliated, stabbed, slandered, poisoned, shot, drowned. But in legacy, he outlived everyone. The bishops who condemned him, the nobles who plotted his murder, the czars who relied on him, the empire that tried to erase him, all gone. And he remains. How? Simple. Rasputin understood something they didn't. He understood that people don't need perfection. They don't want it. Perfection is cold, distant, dressed in white robes and Latin phrases no one understands. People want something human, something cracked and strange and real that still dares to touch the divine. And Rasputin was that. He was mud and magic, wine and whispers. He was a man who screamed at God one night and kissed the feet of a crying child the next. He sinned. A lot. But then he prayed just as hard. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Rasputin's letters, diaries, and the personal testimonies of his followers suggest he believed deeply in his connection to God, even while acknowledging his own brokenness and indulgences. He often claimed, without sin, there can be no salvation. And your fringe tidbit. One of Rasputin's surviving letters ends with a strange doodle, a spiral inside a hand, surrounded by 3 words: bleed, heal, return. No one knows what it means, but some believe he was prophesying his own afterlife. And what an afterlife. He's become a symbol, a warning, a curiosity, a walking contradiction. He's been everything from a punchline to a prophet. They made a disco song about him. He appears in comic books. There's a pub in London with his face on the door. The church says nothing. But deep down, some of them are still watching the door, still checking for shadows, because something about him makes the air colder, even now. Rasputin was a man of God who refused to kneel. He called God his equal. He danced and drank and cried beside caskets and confessed in barns and screamed that forgiveness was only real if you had something worth being forgiven for. That's not doctrine, but it is truth. Messy truth, dangerous truth, the kind that makes people build churches or burn them down. Historians still argue over what Rasputin really wanted. Was it power? Maybe, but he gave most of it away. Was it money? He spent more than he kept. Was it fame? He seemed to enjoy the attention, but he never dressed for it. No, what he really wanted was to matter, to be heard, to reach the trembling part of people no bishop ever touched. And the church couldn't forgive that. Because while they chanted liturgy, he spoke directly to pain. While they handed out doctrine, he handed out hope. While they quoted saints, he became one to some. The wrong kind, perhaps? The dangerous kind. But a kind that left footprints no snowfall could cover. The priest who last saw him alive never wrote a word about that day. But according to a servant, he wept afterward, not out of fear, not out of hatred, out of something like recognition. He was not holy, the priest reportedly whispered, but he knew what holiness was supposed to be, and he wanted it. Maybe that's what made him terrifying. He wasn't the devil. He was a man who stared God in the face and refused to look away. And for that, they killed him. But they didn't forget him. They couldn't. Because you can excommunicate a soul. But a legend stays. It walks behind you in empty chapels. It sings in dreams you don't remember. It laughs quietly when the candles go out. A crack forms in the wall of an old church near Kazan. Not a big one. Thin as a thread, winding through centuries of whitewash and silence, but it runs straight down the mural of St. George, slicing the saint's spear in half. No earthquake, no storm, just a quiet shift, something settling or waking up. The priest who discovers it says nothing, just stares. Then, without knowing why, he mutters, "Grigori," and walks away. Because some names don't need a full prayer. They only need a breath. It's strange, isn't it? All the men who tried to silence him, priests, nobles, politicians, are now footnotes in history books, names in italics on brittle pages. But Rasputin, he's everywhere. Not just in the shadows of cathedrals or the memory of an empire. He's in cartoons, in memes, in vinyl records, in ghost stories whispered at sleepovers, in late-night conversations where someone leans forward and says, "Okay, but do you think he really healed the boy?" Because that's the thing. You're still not sure. Even now. Even after all this time. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Modern scholarship agrees Rasputin's political influence was vastly overstated by his enemies, but his relationship with the royal family, particularly Alexandra, was sincere and deeply rooted in their shared desperation to save the Tsarevich. And your fringe tidbit. In 1993, a small group of Russian Orthodox mystics petitioned to have Rasputin canonized as a saint of suffering. Their request was denied without discussion. One of the petitioners later said, "We were not asking for him to be honored, only recognized." Recognized. Because even those who fear him understand he was real. And that's the church's real problem, even now. Rasputin was undeniably real. Too real. He didn't just preach suffering, he bled with people. He didn't just quote scripture, he made people feel like God was listening. He wasn't clean or careful or doctrinal, but he showed up. Touched the sick, cried with the broken, got drunk with peasants, and reminded them that holiness wasn't something locked in gold. It was something you could find in a snowstorm if you listened close enough. And that terrifies the men in robes. Because if he could be holy, even a little, even for a moment. Then what does that say about all the polished, silent men who stood behind altars and watched? Historians still argue over whether Rasputin was good or evil. But that's not the right question. The right question is, was he needed? And the answer is yes. In a time of war, famine, and spiritual rot, Rasputin offered something no one else dared. A kind of wild hope. Not a promise, not a sermon. Just a hand outstretched, dirty and trembling, saying, "Come here. God isn't finished with you." And people took it. They took it because no one else was offering anything. The church was preaching to the walls, the government was bleeding the country dry, and Rasputin, flawed, foul-smelling, inappropriate, impossible Rasputin, was there, standing in the gap, unasked, uninvited, but irreplaceable. One elderly nun, long retired, once told a journalist in the 1980s, "He wasn't holy, but he was fire, and fire lights the way, even if it burns." And that's what the church can't forgive. Not the sin, not the scandal, but the need. They needed him, just enough to let him in. And when they realized it, it was too late. So they called him a demon, because that's safer than saying he did something we could not. And still, there are candles, hidden ones, lit in back rooms, in private corners of old churches, behind curtains and beside portraits that have no place on official walls. People pray to him, no, but they remember him. And in memory, he moves, not like a ghost, more like a voice, low and gravelly, half drunk and half divine, saying, "Don't look up, look in. That's where God's hiding." And somewhere the church listens, not out loud, but in the quiet moments, when incense hangs too still, when shadows fall the wrong way, when they hear laughter in the empty nave, and wonder if he's come back, just to check in. The train rattles through the Russian countryside, a line of iron and steam cutting across frozen fields. Inside the last car, a historian leans back in her seat, notebook open, eyes scanning an old article printed in yellowed ink. It's about Rasputin. Again. Every few years, someone rediscovers him, writes a new theory, repackages the myth. But the myth refuses to behave. Rasputin never stays where they put him. You make him a villain, and he heals a child. You make him a saint, and he drinks your wine and laughs at your prayers. He exists between categories, like fog, like smoke, like doubt that won't leave after the sermon's done. Outside the train window, a church steeple flashes by, a cross barely visible through the snow. She thinks for just a second that she sees a man in black robes standing beside it. She blinks. Gone. Later, she won't write it down. She's not ready to be that kind of historian. And yet, she'll remember. Because Rasputin isn't just history anymore. He's folklore, pop culture, iconography. He's been played by actors, drawn as a monster, reimagined as a wizard, a zombie, a warlock, a joke. Songs bear his name. Comics resurrect him. Conspiracies insist he didn't die at all. They call him everything but what he was. A wound that never closed. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Rasputin has been portrayed in over 24 major films and series, often as a villain, seducer, or sorcerer, reinforcing a dramatic and distorted image far removed from the complex historical figure he was. And your fringe tidbit. In 2005, an obscure spiritualist group in Eastern Europe claimed to have received messages from Rasputin via seance. He reportedly said, "I am not what they think I was. I only showed them what they wanted." Maybe he did. Maybe that's the real secret. Rasputin didn't lie. He reflected, "You brought your sins, your hopes, your rot, your ache, and he gave it back to you, dressed in prophecy and sweat and contradictions. The nobility saw a threat. The peasants saw a savior. The clergy saw a heretic. The revolution saw a symptom. And they were all right and all wrong. Because Rasputin wasn't there to confirm their beliefs. He was there to disturb them. He once said, "God does not whisper in quiet places. He shouts from the mouths of fools." He might have been talking about himself. And yet here we are, over a century later, still talking about him, still not sure, still asking, who was he? A con man? A healer? A puppet master? A mad monk? A demon? The church called him that, of course. A demon in monk's robes. A corrupter. An embodiment of temptation and spiritual decay. And maybe he was. Or maybe he was something worse. A man who believed too much. Too much in his visions. Too much in his calling. Too much in a God who might have actually been listening. Because belief, real belief, the kind that bleeds and babbles and walks barefoot across kingdoms, it doesn't fit into marble walls and golden chalices. It fits into Rasputin. He didn't need the church. But for a terrifying moment, the church needed him. They needed his charisma, his fearlessness, his miracles. They needed him to be the answer when none of theirs were working. And when that became obvious, when his presence embarrassed of them, when his survival mocked their authority, they turned on him. They didn't just kill him. They tried to unmake him, erase him from the liturgy of memory, strip him from holy ground, burn his body, ban his name. But names like his don't burn. They smolder. They show up in songs and dreams and graffiti in bathroom stalls. They show up in questions whispered after funerals. They show up when the candles go out and the fever doesn't break and no one is answering from the altar. And somewhere behind the veil of fire and frost and silence, you hear the echo of that gravel voice chuckling in the dark. "I told you I wasn't easy to kill." Seem. The final church bell of the village rings low and slow, each strike echoing through the bones of the countryside. It's dusk. Snow falls in silent ribbons across the rooftops. Inside, a few elderly women bow their heads over weathered pews. The priest lights a candle with a sigh and glances toward the empty back row. He doesn't expect to see anyone there. But for the briefest moment, he does. A tall shadow, a beard, a tilt of the head, then nothing. He doesn't check twice, because some ghosts aren't meant to be challenged. And Rasputin, he was never really gone. The church once tried to call him a footnote, an error, a shameful exception. But in trying to cast him out, they accidentally gave him a larger cathedral, one built of memory and fear, of fascination and unanswered questions. No one prays to him, but no one entirely forgets him either. He lives in tension, in contradiction, in the nervous glance between old icons and flickering candles, in the eyes of the young priest who wants to believe, but can't quite shake the feeling that maybe holiness isn't always clean. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The Russian Orthodox Church has never formally reopened the discussion on Rasputin's role or legacy, choosing silence over confrontation, a strategy that has only fueled modern reappraisal and fascination. And your fringe tidbit. In 2016, exactly 100 years after Rasputin's death, a handwritten note was anonymously left in the mailbox of the Moscow Theological Academy. It read, "The church feared him because he believed more honestly than they allowed." No one ever claimed authorship. And maybe that's the final truth. Not that Rasputin was good, not that he was evil, but that he was unacceptable to both the world of men and the world of saints. He didn't fit their script. Too strange for sanctity, too real for heresy. He was a man who walked into royal courts barefoot and smelled like goats, but still made emperors tremble. He was a peasant with a fire in his eyes that frightened archbishops. He was a healer who hurt, and a prophet who lied, and a mystic who drank himself blind and still made mothers believe he had the ear of God. Because maybe, just maybe he did. Maybe Rasputin touched something sacred in the dark. Maybe the divine doesn't always dress in gold and white. Maybe sometimes it's covered in mud, dripping with wine, laughing too loud in the back of the cathedral. The church never wrote him out of its records, but it wrote around him, avoided the name, avoided the questions, because they still don't know what to do with him. They don't know how to explain the man who sinned publicly and still worked miracles in whispers. The man who was stabbed and kept smiling. The man who was poisoned and kept praying. The man who was shot and kept walking. The man who would not die the way they needed him to. So instead they call him a demon, because it's safer than calling him what he really was. A crack in the altar. A reminder that faith is never safe. That belief is not always clean. That God sometimes speaks in broken voices. And now, in the cold silence of this last candlelit evening, the story ends. But the echo remains, not in holy books, but in soft songs, in flickering shadows, in the quiet question no one says out loud. What if he was closer to heaven than we were? The priest finishes his candle. He closes the door behind him. Outside, the snow keeps falling. And far off in the woods, something moves. Not a ghost. Not a saint. Just a story. Still walking. Still burning. Still not done. And now the candle dims. The footsteps fade down stone corridors. The snow falls thicker, softer, sealing the earth in silence. You've walked through a century of whispers tonight, through palaces and chapels, through frozen rivers and burned letters, through the long echo of a man the world could never quite hold. Rasputin is gone, yes, but stories like his don't stay buried. They surface, in strange places, in strange times. When faith is flickering and doubt is loud, you feel him again. Like the creak of a door that wasn't open a moment ago. Like a name you didn't mean to say. Like a prayer that doesn't fit in the usual script. You don't have to believe in miracles. You don't have to believe in demons. You just have to believe that some stories keep moving because they're still unfinished. So breathe. Let the candles melt down. Let the night settle around you like a warm blanket pulled from another time. Outside it's quiet, snow against glass, wind through trees, the hush of a world catching its breath. You are safe here, no thrones to fall, no voices to hush, just you, and sleep, and the knowledge that even the strangest flames burn out eventually. Whatever Rasputin was, prophet, pretender, protector, pawn, he is no longer walking, not in this world. Now there's just you, breathing slowly, letting go. Let the story dissolve into dreams. Let the whispers fade. You've made it to the end, and the end is soft, like candlelight, like falling snow, like forgiveness you never asked for and never quite expected to find. Thank you for listening. Sleep well. If you've made it all the way to the end, leave a comment and tell me what story you'd like to hear next. I genuinely enjoy seeing and reading every kind word you share. Thank you for watching. Sweet dreams and good night.